record it is also through Zoom.
Right. Yeah, I've done this using Zoom.
But if we're not connected to Zoom,
Yeah.
Huh. He's a real rebel.
Oh, you're sitting there. I'm going to sit over here so I can see under the light. I want to see under the light.
Nice. Oh, would you like some curries, please?
Please.
You know what? Take a whole bunch, and if when people show up, give them out of it. Pinchas, Mazel Tov, Mazel Tov. Very nice. Well, how was the bat mitzvah party? Did you do something?
Yeah, we did something.
It was all right.
Yeah, we're gonna do something after the mail of my.
Right. Like something more bigger. David, are you there?
Yep.
Well, it's nice to see your name
Oh,
on
I
the
have to see
screen.
the hospital room.
It's well, I'm sorry. I let David in. Shalom Aleichem. We can bring it nearer. We can bring it nearer. English is fine, right? This one's in English, whatever. It's good. Okay, so after speaking last week a bit about the introduction to the basics of Ohel on Shabbos, right? The basic of the Israel, we saw the Ohel Keva, the Raisa, we saw Ohel Arai, the Rabbanan, we saw the halachas of being Moisif, ala Ohel, adding to a tent, we saw the relevant gemoras and so on. So this week I really want to speak about some, a lot of practical halachas that are relevant to making Ohelim on Shabbos in various forms. So we want to speak about the following. First of all, we'll speak about things that open up. This is beds, foldable beds. All right, we all have these beds that open up, right? Foldable tables, foldable beds, and so on and so forth. We'll speak about those. Then we'll speak about umbrellas. All right, what's the halachah of an umbrella on Shabbos? Opening an umbrella, opening one of these things on Shabbos, right? This is a kind of parasol, you would call it, right? Are you allowed to open this on Shabbos? Question mark. Okay, so we'll speak about those. Then we'll speak about some other interesting cases. What about putting lids on pots on Shabbos? Are you allowed to cover a pot with a lid? We'll see the Shulchan Aruch doesn't like using lids of certain types. So we'll see about using lids on Shabbos because it's making an ohel. You're protecting the food from things that might fall in, flies and who knows what. So we'll speak about that. And we'll speak about drawers, because drawers are also an interesting problem of ohel. The Chayei Adam says you're not allowed to take out drawers and put them in on Shabbos because of ohel problems. So we'll speak about these halachas. Let's start off with the Gemara. The Gemara, in the first source, it's number 15, page 15. Okay, and the Gemara there says in the underlined part, aval mita v'kisei traskol v'asla mutar lintoisam lechatchila. The Gemara there is speaking about ohalim, ohel keva, ohel arai. This is Gemara Kuf Lamed Ches in Maseches Shabbos, and the Gemara says that when it's something which is foldable, okay, kisei traskol, which is a chair that is foldable, meaning it folds in and folds out, okay, and the same thing about a mita v'kisei traskol, mutar lintoisam lechatchila. You're allowed to set them up on Shabbos. Very interesting machlokes between Rashi and Tosfos, and the Rishonim, of course, speak about this also. What's the problem? What's the potential isur? So Rashi says the potential isur is that you might fix it on Shabbos. You might actually make it fixed, and that would be a problem of Mechabers patish. Tosfos says, no way. Tosfos says, this sugya is speaking about Ohalim. It's an Ohel-related sugya. It's an Ohel sugya, and therefore the potential problem is also a potential problem of making an Ohel on Shabbos. And why is it permitted? So Rashi says it's permitted because the ha'avid v'koi, it's already there. Meaning you're not doing anything. Another Rashi says, the lo midi ovid, right? It's lisuvi be'alma. You're setting it up, but it's already there from before. And Tosfos says that the same kind of concept will help us also for Ohalim. Meaning even though you're setting up an Ohel, at least an Ohel of sorts, it's a mutar. We saw last week, you remember last week we spoke about 3 categories of Ohel. There's an Ohel which protects you from the sun and from the rain. And that's the Ohel that if it's kavua, is an Ohel keva, right? That's an Ohel keva. That's your potentially doraisa Ohel. Then you have an Ohel which isn't made for protection underneath, but it's also used for underneath. That was the case of the bed. We saw in the Shulchan Aruch that making a bed on Shabbos is also, it's also midrabanan, because even though the bed is mainly used for sleeping on it, but it's also used for things underneath it. You keep your shoes under the bed, you might have a storage space under the bed, right? So this is a both. And then we saw the case of, according to many poskim, a table which isn't used for underneath at all. And then that's not a problem of Ohel on Shabbos. So over here we have a case of a bed, and even though there's a problem of Ohel arai for a bed, but nonetheless, where it's foldable, then it's mutar to use it on Shabbos, mutar to put it up on Shabbos. Okay, so foldable beds, based on the Gemora, are mutar on Shabbos, and this is paskined in the Shulchan Aruch. Have a look in, it's in page 18 of these Mechabers. So this starts on page 17, Sif Hey. Okay, you see it at the bottom of page 17. Do you see it? Sif Hey. Kisei ha'asoi prokim. This is a kisei that's made of a variety of pieces. Right, you open them up, the ha'or niftach, and the leather, right, is stretched out. Okay, this is your classic case of a folding chair or a folding bed. Okay, and then it folds up. It's permitted to open it and to close it, even lechatchila. There's no problem. And the Mechabers brings Rashi. He says the ha'avid v'kayim ba'odim. It's already there, meaning you're not doing something new. Everything is there already, and all you're doing is opening it up and closing it again. From the sound of it, what the Shulchan Aruch is telling us is that, or the way that Rashi and the Mechabers says, it's a bit like a door. Right? Just like we said last week, if you remember, that there's no problem opening and closing a door on Shabbos, even though the door is going to be connected to the wall, and therefore it looks like boiner because you're right, affixing something to the wall. That's not a problem. Why? Because when you see a person doing it, he's not building something, he's just opening a door. So over here also, he's not creating an Ohel. All he's doing is opening and closing an already existing contraption on Shabbos. And because all you're doing is opening and closing it up, therefore it's mutar to do it on Shabbos, and one doesn't have to worry about creating an Ohel. Ad kan, what we want to speak about concerning the beds and the chairs, and like we say, those are mutar. Now there's another case in the Gemora that is worth mentioning. A second case in the Gemora that speaks about a similar idea is about a talis. And the Gemora says, you're allowed to open up a on Shabbos. It's a folded talis, which is it's tied to a peg on the floor, and you're allowed to open it up and to create a tent, but only if there are strings, only if it's already prepared from before Shabbos with appropriate strings to open it up and close it down again. It's you could call it a kind of a curtain. It's in the Gemora again, it's a sheet. It's a sheet. It's mentioned here in the sources in the Ran. The Ran mentioned it. It's mentioned by the Rif at the bottom of page 15. It's based on Yerushalmi. So the Rif brings it. Talis kafula, a folded talis. Lo yaseh, vim asab aval asab, because it's an oil aray, it's not an oil keva. Vim karach alei achut, oy meshicha mutar l'intoisa lechatchila. Right, so the Rif brings this Yerushalmi that if it was prepared from before with appropriate strings, meaning it was already prepared as something which is something that you open up and close it, the whole time, like a door, it's made for opening and closing, then it's mutar on Shabbos. And the Rif explains, it's tied between two walls, and it goes down to the ground, etc., etc. You don't have 3 tefachim, and therefore it's an oil aray, meaning, like we learned last week, if it would have a tefach at the top, then this would be considered an oil keva. This would be like a gazebo, but it's not. It's only an oil aray. He says, so he says, therefore, and this is similar to the case of our mutar v'kisei, okay? Well, the case of the gazebo is potentially different because it could be considered an oil keva. It has 3 tefachim on the top. If the Rif talking about a case that doesn't have 3 tefachim on the top, in the case of your gazebo, it certainly has 3 tefachim on the top. And the question would be, is a gazebo kavua? Is it called keva or not? And generally speaking, I would say that a gazebo is called an oil keva because it's there can keep it there for months, right? It's a perfectly strong contraption that you can leave there for a long time. Depends which one you buy, I agree. But it wouldn't fit into the category of the Rif. The Rif's talking about that there's no 3 tefachim on top. And the gazebo certainly has 3 tefachim on top. Now, this sugya is the main sugya which is related to the case of opening up umbrellas on Shabbos. Yes, Avi? That's like we spoke about last week. No, it means like this. It means that if you have a tefach up here, then that's a potential oil keva. But what angle do you need for it not to be considered? So it's an angle which within 3 tefachim of height doesn't have a tefach of length. That's what it means. It's defining the angle at which it's no longer considered an oil keva because there's no flat. So what's flat? It doesn't have to be perfectly flat. The definition of flat for this purpose is that within 3 tefachim of height, you don't have, 3 tefachim of height, you don't have a tefach of length. All right. So now let's speak about our question of umbrellas. To fashion somewhere in the 18th century, and Jews started using them. And one of the first, not the first, but one of the first major tshuvas to relate to umbrellas on Shabbos is the Nodeh Beyhudah. The Nodeh Beyhudah, very famous tshuva. It's in Tinyana Siman Lamed. And the Nodeh Beyhudah says, in my community, some people started to use these new fancy, contraptions that protect you from the rain or from the sun. And he asks, is it mutar or not? So he says straight away, I told my kehillah, don't use this on Shabbos. And he says, most of them listened to me, right? Most of them listened and stopped using these things on Shabbos. But then he says, you know what? I need to explain myself, right? What's the problem? Why is this asur? And he says, he's writing to someone who asks him the question. The person who asked him the question had a written communication with someone else. He doesn't say who it is. And this other person says it's mutar to use this on Shabbos. No problem. And he gives a couple of reasons why. And then this shayel, the person asking the Nodeh Beyhudah, says, I thought it's asur. And the Nodeh Beyhudah says, yes, you're right, and he's wrong. And he says the following. He says, listen. The Nodeh Beyhudah says, why should we think that it's mutar? Yes, Avi. It's good. The Nodeh Beyhudah, and we have it here, by the way. The tshuva is here on page 19, I think. Yeah, on page 19. I'm not going to read the whole thing inside. But the Nodeh Beyhudah says as follows. He says, first of all, he says the main source that's being brought to explain why it's mutar on Shabbos is this source in the Rif, right? The Rif speaks about this talis that's being spread out to open on Shabbos, and if it has strings before it's mutar, says the shayel, he brings from this other authority that says it's mutar, and he says that our case of an umbrella is this case of the talis, right? Just like the talis is mutar to open up, so too over here should also be mutar to open up. Now it's interesting. I would have brought the case of the bed. The case of the bed seems to be a very nice case to bring also. However, the shayel didn't bring the case of the bed, and presumably the reason why is because the case of the bed is a more lenient type of oil, right? It's not mainly for shelter. It's mainly for being on top, and therefore he chooses to bring the case of the talis rather than the case of the bed. Okay, but that's the main source that he brings. And the Nodeh Beyhudah says no. He says the Rif only permitted the case of the talis because there's no 3 tefachim at the top. There's no tefach at the top, excuse me. But in the case of the umbrella, where you do have a tefach on the top, he says there the Rif wouldn't be matter. And he says, you know what? He says maybe even there would be a chiyuv skila, because maybe even it would be a malachah d'oraisa, because he said the same Rif that speaks about the talis. He says, well, the Rif himself says that if it's a case where you don't have these strings before Shabbos, meaning it's a regular case of this talis, then it's potentially an issa d'oraisa. Poskim are very busy with this Rif. Why would it be an issa d'oraisa? Because it seems to be only an oil arai. However, the Nodeh Beyhudah mentions, right, look at the paragraph where there's the little finger, it's a 19. He says, Umachisi bahem, I told my kehillah, right? But the Rashti Beisa Pan Beisa Knesses, I gave a drasha in Shul. Shu is a gama, Vamajish Afilichish Shani Lisa Skila. I'm worried there might even be Nisa Skila using an umbrella. Opening an umbrella, says the Nodeh Beyhudah, might even be a Nisa Skila. Remarkable. Most people, like I mentioned, listen to what I say. Now, yeah, that's a flat tefach, absolutely. It's not, within 3 tefachim of height, you have much more than a tefach of length, and then for the umbrella, certainly there's a tefach there. The whole umbrella is basically flat. I'm not sure if you even have 3 tfachim height in the whole umbrella. It's the angle, depends on the angle. If you have a very slanted, right, if you have a very slanted umbrella, I'm sorry? Yes, or you don't open up, then that's the riff. Then you're good. Yeah, then you're good. If you don't open the umbrella up entirely, if it's slanted, if it's very slanted, again, depends on the angle. But you're right, if you don't have a tefach of length within 3 tefachim of height in your umbrella, then you're good. That's a good question, and we'll speak about that in a minute. It's a good question. I like that question. Why don't we make a Shabbos umbrella? That's a nice question. I'll speak about that when I speak about the Chazon Ish. Remind me.
Did you move across the Sefer within 3?
Right. Is your angle that you have? You can have a big angle and a small angle. Right. I unfortunately I didn't figure out the degrees, but it's a degree of an angle at which you have 3 tefachim going down in height, while you have one in. I'm sorry. You have 1 in length over 3 in height. It's a pretty severe angle. Meaning, you'd have to have a pretty severe umbrella to not have this. Now, although you can work it out. David, can you work this out for us? What's the angle? It's not even complicated. It's like easy. All right. Yeah. Your sines and cosines and whatever. All right. So it says in Nodeh Beyhudah, I'm not buying because the talis is different. The talis doesn't have the tefach, and we do have the tefach. And because we do have the, I'm sorry? No, 19 degrees, like this, you mean? 19 degrees this way? No, 19 is nothing. But it depends which 19, from where? 19 here or 19 here? Yeah, it would be pretty tight, but you know what? We'll do the mathematics later. I'll post it on the group the exact angle that we're talking about. In any case, the Nodeh Beyhudah is therefore very machmir, and he says, you know what? Maybe it's even d'oraisa based on this riff, because he understands. It's a big question with the riff. Does the riff speak about a talis? Does it have to be going down with mechitzos, and only then it's a potential d'oraisa, or even without mechitzos? Obviously, an umbrella doesn't have mechitzos, doesn't have walls. So can you have an Ohel keva without walls, and it would be considered d'oraisa? Big question. The Nodeh Beyhudah says, I agree that it wouldn't be d'oraisa according to most Rishonim, but there's a chashash over here, and therefore, for sure, we should be machmir. And therefore, he says one should definitely be wary of using umbrellas on Shabbos. Later on, he actually mentions also the potential source of our kisei, of our bed, and so on. But he uses Rashi. He goes with Rashi, like I mentioned before. Rashi there says the problem isn't Ohel, the problem is some other Ohel, and therefore we can't use Rashi. And therefore that's basically what he speaks about. It's pretty clear that he has something against umbrellas. He doesn't. He's anti-umbrellas because he could have brought other sources to be more makel, but he doesn't. He brings sources and he says that for sure there's no room to be makel on our umbrellas on Shabbos. He says because the talis, there's no tefach, like the Rif points out. In our talis, we're talking about a sharp angle. There's no tefach. That's why you can be matter the talis. But in our case, it's not such a sharp angle, and therefore it's also. That's the gist of the Nodeh Beyhudah. There's much more that he speaks about, but in our framework, that's enough of the Nodeh Beyhudah. The main bar plugta of the Nodeh Beyhudah is the Chasam Sofer. Yes, Avi? Correct. The Nodeh Beyhudah speaks about that. The Nodeh Beyhudah says, what about if you left your umbrella open? Says the Nodeh Beyhudah, then you don't have a problem. However, it's maris ayin. It looks very bad. Well, you'll walk around with an umbrella. People will think that you've opened it on Shabbos, and therefore he says, the wording is, he says, you know what? Ra'ui lesor. He says, "Havare shemitzad maris ha'ayin she'achshedu she'tiknu hayoyim ra'ui lesor." It's ra'ui lesor. It's worthy of prohibiting. With a stroller, no, because it's not an umbrella. I mean, the umbrella, he says, because it has a tzad d'oraisa, and because it's something which we generally don't leave it open, but we close it and then we open it, then there's a clear maris ayin. For the buggy, we often leave it open, so you wouldn't have the maris ayin with the buggy. Yes, that's actually a good question. Very famous tshuva of Rav Moshe Feinstein about that concerning eating in restaurants. Do we make a new maris ayin or not? But the Nodeh Beyhudah says over here that because it's such a blatant maris ayin, because we open it up and close it, so ra'ui lesor. He doesn't say it's awesome mamash, but he says ra'ui lesor. The umbrella? If you've tipped it on the side. Well, you can just say, what about when it's on the ground? Right. So in generally speaking, even if the umbrella on, but because it's already opened up and you're not opening up the Ohel on Shabbos, then it wouldn't consider to be making an Ohel on Shabbos. This the Chazon speaks about this, that by holding something up, there's no a human being doesn't have an Ohel. An Ohel is something which has walls or is somehow held up and so on. Or in this case, you're again, the Chazon is also makel. Well, you know what? We'll see. This is one of the arguments that's related to the Mekilim here. The main makel on the question of and the bar plukta of the Nodeh Beyhudah is a Chasam Sofer. Chasam Sofer says that even though he brings the Nodeh Beyhudah, he says, I saw the Nodeh Beyhudah. The Chasam Sofer is on page 20 of the notes. He says, I saw the Nodeh Beyhudah. But he says, I see that the general minig is to be makel on this. Everyone's using umbrellas. He says, most people are walking around on Shabbat with their umbrellas. So he says, look for a makom heter. He says, you know what? I know that people generally use goyim to open up their umbrellas. But he says, so what if they use goyim? Even if you use a goy to open it up on Shabbos, it has to be a shvus b'malka mitzvah to be mekel. And here it's not a shvus b'malka mitzvah, so still it would be also. So how come everyone is being mekel to use umbrellas on Shabbos? Well, Tsar, yeah, it would have to be a pretty, not just. He said that's not good enough. He says that's not good enough. It has to be makom mitzvah, tzad rabim. Yeah, again, there are certain heterim you could use. What in? Yeah, but it depends what he said. This. If it's shvus to shvus, using a goy for drabanan, yes. But here he says, for a little drizzle. Come on, Avi. Oh, you mean in the shul? Well, yeah, that's actually a good question. What's going to happen when we start having rain, if we'll still be outside. That's of course very pertinent, and what would we do? We could like put up an umbrella, right? We could put up an umbrella, or opening up. If you open up before Shabbos, there's no problem anyway. Certainly Maris sign, but we need to have a big umbrella. You know what? Let's get to that soon. Let's go through the basics first and understand why the Chasam Sofer is makel on this. Chasam Sofer says that after Ian Rav on this, he says, I don't see any problem to be makel. And the meaning why he said there's no problem to be makel is that he says that which the Nodeh Beyhudah says, that there's a chashash doraisa here. The Chasam Sofer says, no way. There's like no doraisa element in an umbrella. He said it's not possible to have any doraisa here. Number one, he says it's all temporary. An umbrella is opening and closing the whole time. There's nothing permanent about an umbrella, and therefore it's certainly not an Ohel keva. He said there's no way you can call this an Ohel keva. It's all permanent, and it's all temporary, and therefore there can't be sad of a doraisa. He says, second of all, he says, you know what? This is a very strange type of Ohel. It's an Ohel that you carry around with you. He says, an Ohel that you carry around with you, that's not an Ohel keva. That's not a doraisa Ohel. He says, in the Mishkan, we don't find such an Ohel that you carry around with you. And therefore, he says, it can't be doraisa on any level. Mutar. The Ohel in the Mishkan is learned out from the Mishkan. What is called Ohel Moed. So setting up the Mishkan itself is the Ohel itself. But the Chasam Sofer says there's no way that you can tell me that that's going to be called an Ohel. And he says furthermore, and I mentioned this before, you only have an Ohel when you have mechitzos. Only when you have walls that reach down to the ground, that's your Isa. If you don't have mechitzos reaching down to the ground, then it's no way doraisa. And then he says, you know what? If there's no doraisa, then there's no durabanan either, because in this case, just like we find in the case of the talis kfula, right? You're opening up your talis. Why is it mutar? Because it's an Ohel arai. Why is it an Ohel arai in the case of the talis? Because you don't have a tefach. In our case, it's for a different reason, because of all these three reasons that he brings. But he says one way or the other, it's an Ohel arai, and it fits into our rubric talis with a string, and therefore it's mutar. Having reached this stage, I would have said, and this is what the Chazon Ish says, that just like we find in the bed, right, the case of the bed is mutar, your folding bed is mutar because it's an Ohel arai, right, and it's folding, and therefore it's mutar. So also your umbrella is an Ohel arai, and it's folding, and therefore it's mutar. The Chazon Ish says very remarkably, Chazon Ish says, it's on page 22, thank you. Chazon Ish says very strongly, he says, look at the beginning, the top words. Divrei Nodeh Beyhudah, he says, B'ptichas parasol, right, umbrella, b'Shabbos, einam misyashvim. He says that they're not good. He says, Dezem mamash din kisei traskal. This is exactly the case, he says, of your kisei traskal. It's exactly the case. Ve'einam aleik. He says, don't give me any chilukim. He says, he doesn't buy any of the chilukim that the Nodeh Beyhudah says and that others suggest. He says, no, he says, ein kan Ohel. He said this is not called an Ohel at all. I should mention that Acharonim do make the chiluk. They do say that even though they're both Ohel arai, even if you agree that an umbrella is only an Ohel arai, but nevertheless, it's different from the bed, like we said before, that the bed is not made for shelter underneath, and the umbrella is made for shelter underneath. And therefore, even if you have the folding chair which we're makel on, that's not necessarily a source for the umbrella. But the Chazon says it is. Chazon says it is. He says he doesn't see why it should be aser. So we have very clearly a real machlokes between the achronim here, right? We have the Nodeh Beyhudah. No, he says at the end of the same paragraph, he says even though there's no problem of opening it up on Shabbos, but he says it's avsha milsa, right? He says it's like uvdin dechayel, right? Avsha milsa, it's very recognizable that it's avsha milsa is a chiddush to use avsha milsa here, but he says it's uvdin dechayel. He says it's gur and pirza. He says we've asked other things. And he says, and therefore, Hare Hadava Masal Chachamim Ligdor Geder B'Makam Pirza. And therefore, he says, it's good that we don't use it on Shabbos. Oh, that's similar to the folding chair and the folding bed. Because you're not constructing something together, and it's only one body that's opening and closing, then that's why the Gemora is makel on the folding chair and the folding bed. But it's good that you're opening and closing. You're not doing anything. It's already everything is there. You're just opening and closing it like a door, like we said before. And therefore he says, and therefore it's mutar. It's the same thing. I realize that we're time sensitive here. Let me just mention briefly. Then we'll finish the umbrella business. I'll just mention briefly that the mission's machmeh with umbrellas. He doesn't like umbrellas. He brings a range of poskim that are machmeh. He says Yeshem Mekilim, but he doesn't even mention the Chasam Sofer by name, right? Why doesn't he mention him by name? Because he doesn't want people to be makel on umbrellas. So the Mechabers doesn't like it. He's machmeh. Aruch HaShulchan, I saw, is also a machmeh on umbrellas. Doesn't like them at all. At the same time, the parasols, all right, this type of thing. So I saw that the Shmir Shabbos Hilchos, all right, brings Rav Shlomo Zalman in a few places, says that it's mutar lechatchila. He says it's mutar lechatchila to open up the parasol on Shabbos. And the reason why is that he's relying on the heterim, the Chazon Ish, and so on. And even though there's a minig not to use the umbrella on Shabbos, but this is fixed in the ground, it's not moving around, it's less avsha milsa, and therefore he says to use a parasol on Shabbos, he says, I think I might have brought this somewhere. I'm sorry. It's on 23. Oh, thank you. Yeah, so it's on 23. On 23, he says, well, first of all, he said the if it's connected to a wall and you open it up, it's on hinges or something, it's mutar to open it up on Shabbos. And he says the same thing about a parasol, that it's mutar to open it up on Shabbos, because here, v'chein mutar liftoch shimshia, parasol, right? Mechabers. Oh, over here it's Mechabers le'eglat yeladim. Okay, mutar liftoch b'Shabbos. But the same thing about connected to the ground. I can't find where it's written here. But Rav Shlomo Zalman also said that one of these you're allowed to open up on Shabbos. Like I said, if an umbrella is opened up before Shabbos, then me'ikar adin, even according to the Nodeh Beyhudah, there's no problem at all. However, minig Yisrael b'chol makom is not to use umbrellas on Shabbos. I think that the idea of creating a Shabbos umbrella is an interesting idea, because if we'll make it in a way that clearly differentiates the regular umbrellas in a way that, let's say, it can't be opened more than this angle. Let's open it up more than the angle that's permitted. Then I think it's a good idea. It's like maybe a good money-making scheme to think of this. So I wish anyone who takes this up success with the venture. Yeah. Royalties, yeah. If it's worth it, I'll be happy to do that. Let me speak very briefly. We've spent a long time on umbrellas. I wanted also to speak about a couple of other questions. One of them is a question of lids on Shabbos. I'm going to skip the primary sources on this and get straight to the Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch I've brought it over here on page 18 of the notes. Look at page 18, Sif Yud Gimel at the top of page 18. Okay, Beged sheshoitchem al pi hachavet. You want to put some kind of a cloth on top of a barrel lechasois. Lo yishtchenu al pnei kuloi. Don't cover up all of your barrel. Mishum Ohel, because you're making an Ohel, right? It's a tent, all right? It's a funny sort of a tent, all right? But because you're putting a sheet over the barrel to protect the wine from whatever it is, creepy crawlies, okay? Then that's called an Ohel. If there's a tefach of air, right? If the barrel is completely full, it's fine. But if there's a tefach of air between the wine and the top of the barrel, then that's considered an Ohel, all right? And therefore you would have a problem, says the Shulchan Aruch. And that's why the Mechabers says, very interesting, the Mechabers says, what about if you want to make a table on Shabbos? In a way that's mutar. You want to make a table, so you have two barrels, one next to the other, put a plate on top of the barrels. Says the Mechabers, put the barrels upside down. Don't have the open side up, have the open side down, and then you're not making an Ohel on the barrels. Interesting, right? Very machmir, right? Between the barrels, it's fine because you want the table. You don't want anything under the table. But the problem is, what about the barrels themselves? Says the Mechabers, yeah, we have to worry about making an Ohel. So presumably the barrels are I think the barrels are even empty. Right, you wouldn't flip them over, yeah. Yeah. Well, let me get to that in a minute. Absolutely, there is a size in it. The Mechabers mentioned it's important to note this. Mechabers mentioned that there's an added stringency when you move the barrel first. If you don't move it at all, then you're not considered to be making the mechitzas. The mechitzas is already there. But if you move them somewhere else, then it's as if you've made the mechitzas because you've put them somewhere else. I'm not going to get into it because it's mechudesh tekesvara. The Chai Adam mentions this svara. It's a mechudesh tekesvara. Why are we makel to use our lids today, and we're not worried about it? By the way, size is important. It's only when it's big that we would think of this as an Ohel. The idea over here is like this. Generally speaking, when we cover over a pot, we don't think, oh, I'm making it. Okay, you think you're putting a lid on your pot. Okay, if a person looks at it, what's this person doing? Is he making an Ohel, or is he putting a lid on a pot? The answer is he's putting a lid on a pot. However, well, maybe a lid on a pot is by definition an Ohel. So generally speaking, it isn't. A lid on a pot isn't considered an Ohel. However, and why not? Because the lid on a pot is not just to protect the what's underneath it. It's for a variety of reasons. When you boil, that it shouldn't boil over, that it shouldn't spill, and so on and so forth. It's different in type than making an Ohel. And that's why the Mechabers, not the Mechabers, the Rav Shlomo Zalman says, if the lid has a handle, and therefore it's clearly a lid, it's clearly something which is not, you're not making a kind of sheltering the contents by making an Ohel, then it's certainly mutar. What, to put a lid on a thing? You're right, but you're just putting the lid on because that's a normal thing to do. It's not considered an action of building a tent. It's a lid that comes on and comes off. If you're bringing a special sheet, not a special sheet, if you're bringing a sheet and you're draping a sheet over a large pot, then yes, that's an Ohel. But if you're just using a purpose-made lid, then again, it's like a door. You're putting it on, you're taking it off. It's purpose-made to put it on and off, and it's not an Ohel dika formulation. And therefore, there wouldn't be a problem And by the way, that's why some are also makel on the roofs of buggies, even if it doesn't have a tefach before, because it's like a door, because it's made to open and close. However, some are machmer about that, and therefore, I think even I brought here, I think from maybe Ravad Yosef. Yeah, Ravad Yosef, Chazon Ovadia. He says yesh matirim and yesh oisrim, and he says yesh oisrim because it's because it's often opened up and left open on a permanent way, so we don't look at it like a folding. Well, again, this gets into the question of your folding chairs. Is the folding chair like the umbrella, right? Is this like an umbrella because it opens up? So it says yesh matirim yesh oisrim. The general minig is to leave a tefach open before Shabbos, even though, yeah, and that's what he brings downstairs in the notes. He says the Chazon Ish, based on the Chazon Ish, this would be mutar because it's no worse than an umbrella. He says, though, however, because some are chelek on this, many are chelek on this, therefore we leave the open tefach. However, in our case of the lid is not classified as an ohel in this case, and therefore, when you have a handle on the lid and it's a purpose-made lid, then certainly the minig is to be makel. I haven't seen anyone be machmer on this, on actual lids. However, if you don't have a lid and you're using a sheet, then yes, Shulchan Aruch says you have to leave a tefach open. We haven't spoken about drawers, but I think time's up. So let's call it a day for now.
Why was other things such as like for the parasol, for example, what like in mutar, you still have the issue of the tefach and the tefach.
The Chazon, the Shmir Shabbat Hilchos is not worried about that issue. Yeah, because it's good, yeah, like the Chazon Ish, because it's gufechad, because it's like your folding bed, because it's all arai, because it's like the talis, like the Chasam Sofer, and so on. Yes, that's true. Over here, it's not the acute angle, but it's arai. It's arai because it's opening and closing. It's not permanent in any way. Because it's regularly opened and closed. Again, according to the Mekilim. Then the Nodeh Beyhudah wouldn't like this either. The Nodeh Beyhudah wouldn't like this either. But we have a minig to be machmer on umbrellas. We don't have a minig to be machmer on parasols. Really? You know, some people are very superstitious about this. You know, but it's very good that you. No, it's very good that you're training them not to be superstitious. That's very important. Training them in anti-avodah zarah. These superstitions are, you know, bad sources. I wouldn't worry. I would not be worried. Isaac wants to come in now, so.